Good morning, everyone. I heard that. Great. My name's Anthony Reimer. Welcome to my talk on deployment techniques for small labs. I don't know if any of you were here when I gave the version 1.0 of this talk in 2012, but a lot of things have changed since then. So it's time for an update. And next slide. So for almost 2 decades now, I've been running small labs for students and faculty in art, music, drama, and dance at the University of Calgary. It's a pretty controlled environment for me. I can walk to every computer. They're within about 50 steps of my desk. I don't have to deal with individual laptops or Macs, other than when computers are done with, we hand them down to other users. So that's the context from which I'm bringing you today's session. And my goals today are basically to share what I've learned that have made me more nimble, more responsive, more effective, and quite frankly, have more time so that I can learn even more skills, make my life easier, more effective again, and to give back to the community that has given me a lot of these tools. If you've checked out my bio, you'll know that my degrees are in music and education, not computer science. So if I can do it, you can do it. Since I will touch on a lot of things, this is going to be really packed for time. I'll also point you to some more in-depth resources that you can tap after the fact. And as always, the slides will be available right after the talk. Next slide, and we should be on a nice little grid of 4 items. These are the topics. Yeah, I missed a slide option. These are the topics that I discussed in 2012: packaging, image creation, deployment, and user management. These are all relevant topics today, but in 4 years, the tools are almost all completely different, and thankfully, better. So before I speak to those, let's talk a little terminology so we're clear on what we mean. Next slide. I want to start by defining deployment and maintenance. When I'm talking about deployment, I'm talking about taking a Mac from an unknown or perhaps undesired state, moving it into a known bootable state, and then after that, taking it to the end result, the golden state that we wanted in for deployment. Now I break that down a bit. Many people used to refer to that whole cycle as imaging, but I do break it down such that, as you see in blue, image creation is a step, and these days it's actually an optional step in some cases. You then take that image or an OS installer to move it to a known bootable state, and then everything else is done in customizing. One of the things I'll talk about a little more later is where the balance is, how much we're going to put in the imaging part and how much we're going to put in the customizing part. Next slide. And of course, once you've got it in your desired state, it doesn't stay there for long, especially if you've deployed something like Flash. So you need to keep collecting updates and then pushing them back out. So this is the cycle, and this is the terminology I'm going to use today. I'm betting a lot of you are coming to this session and you use this method, well, what I call the golden machine method. You install all your software in a golden machine, tweak some settings, next slide, capture that image using DeployStudio or some other tool. Next, push it out using DeployStudio, sometimes with manual tweaking after the fact. That's that little minion there. Next. And then maintaining the Mac by manually fetching updates and pushing them out using a tool like Apple Remote Desktop. Does that sound familiar to anyone? If it does, then you've come to the right session. We can improve on all aspects of this, even using a couple of the same tools. Next slide. So I will still use those same 4 topics, but we'll talk about a whole bunch of different stuff. Let's start with packages. Next slide. In the golden machine method, we manually install packages and then we forget about them. What we want to do now is start collecting. Next. What we don't want to do anymore, or what's out of fashion right now, is snapshotting. Snapshotting is great for finding out information about what does an app install where, but it is the absolute last resort for you to get something deployed to machines. We'll talk about a few better methods as we go along. Next, what the hip kids are doing is just collecting vendor packages and finding ways to install them, often on first boot, and then automating downloads, especially, as I mentioned before, that list of updates that keep coming and coming that you have to deal with. Next slide. So why packages? Well, they can be used in every part of the deployment and maintenance workflow. Packages are universal in that way. They're modular in that you can pull stuff in and pull stuff out. No more do you have to say, oh, how did I do that? Or how do I uninstall that if there's no uninstaller? If you're using packages as your workflow, you just take the old one out and put the new one in. And in that way, it's self-documenting. Whether it's the fact that you have a group of packages and thus you know what you put into your secret sauce, or the fact that you can examine the packages and see what is going in that way, you don't have to worry about how did I do that. Next slide. Updates. This is a pain point for most of us. If you're running a lab, you're probably managing some of these yourself. I put the 2 versions of Firefox, the extended support release, which I use, and then the regular release just as a point of comparison. How many updates do you think we've had in the last year on these products? How about this many? Next. Right? Office. The plus sign stands for there are 4 hot fixes on top of the regular 10 updates. Actually 4 for Word, 1 for Excel, and even the auto updater got updated 5 times. Firefox, Flash Player, you'd probably expect that from Flash Player, but because of the regular releases of Firefox, we get lots of updates. So, next slide. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a tool that could, next, check it for you, next, download any updates that you needed, and next, post-process if you needed it for your workflow. Let's say you needed a package instead of a drag and drop installer. Well, next slide. AutoPkg to the rescue. Now, I'm hoping there are some of you in the room that are using AutoPkg. And for those of you who are, some of the next 20 minutes or so will be a little bit of review. But I'm sure that you'll agree that if you're not using AutoPkg, it's worth the time to spend on it so people can use it, because it's one of the tools that you can really leverage to make your life easier. AutoPkg is an open source tool that does all this. Next slide. Here's how the principal developers describe it on the GitHub project page. So just take a minute to soak that in. And let's break this down a bit. Next. AutoPkg is about automation. So it automatically goes to the web server or the online source of where the software is, grabs the latest one if it hasn't been asked before, or if it's already there, it's got the latest one, and it sees that, it doesn't bother downloading anything. Next, packaging. Once you have that new version, you can process it to match your workflow. I mentioned one case, turning a drag and drop installer into a package. But sometimes, like I have a package that gets customized. The vendor has actually said, run this command line thing if you need to customize it to the server you're using it for. That happens to be Sassafras Key Server. And so you can actually create a part of your steps to do that automatically every time instead of having to do it manually every time. Next. So it collects it for installation, and then you can integrate it to whatever deployment tools you're using, whether that's Monkey, which is what the original authors use, or it could even be Casper, for example. So let's look at that deployment and maintenance diagram again with this in mind. Next slide. Excuse me. So with a tool like AutoPkg, you can feed every part of your workflow if you so choose. Personally, I so choose. AutoPkg can automate a lot of things you do manually, saving time and errors. If you implement nothing else from today, as I suggested, implement AutoPkg. So, next slide. How do I get this lovely piece of software? 3 ways. The original AutoPkg project home, and in fact, all these 3 methods go to that source. It's on GitHub. That's also where you'll see the recipes, which you'll find out in a sec. AutoPkgr from the Lindy group. This is a really nice GUI add-on that was part of the MacBrain.org hackathon. I think it's almost 2 years ago now in San Francisco. And Elliot Jordan, one of the authors, is at PSU this week. And it's a great front end for AutoPkg. I still use command line as well, but it's pretty nice. And then there's Monkey in a Box. So if you decide that you also want to deploy Monkey as a maintenance tool, Tom Bridge has written a wonderful script that pulls in AutoPkg, AutoPkgr, Monkey, and a bunch of Monkey graphical tools that people have added to make your life easier. I think most of you will start with AutoPkgr, but these are all good options. Next slide. So AutoPkg does its automation through recipes and processors. It's just like when you're preparing your favorite recipe from a cookbook. Next slide. A recipe has 3 main parts. It's got a name, it has ingredients, and there are the instructions on how to assemble the thing. Next, AutoPkg has recipe parts that are coordinated with that. So each recipe has an identifier, has input values, and then a process section. Let's take a quick look at a recipe. Next slide. This is one that I wrote or adapted from other people's work. And if you start writing your own recipes, this is the way to do it anyway, adapting other people's work. This is for an open source music notation program called MuseScore. As you can see, it's in a familiar format to you, I trust. It's a plist. Next. And here are these sections I spoke about. Identifier, input, and process. Next slide. And just like there are different kinds of recipes that can go in a cookbook, there are also different kinds of AutoPkg recipes. Next. Here are the 3 most common ones. And know that everything starts with the original download. So we, in general, have most recipes in quantity are download recipes. Next slide. And just like a good chicken stock recipe, next, you can reference that recipe in other recipes. This is one of the really powerful features of AutoPkg. You can build upon the work of others and allow others to build upon your work as well. It's essentially recipes are crowdsourced. It's really great. Next. So if someone else has already figured out how to download certain software that you need in a different format for your workflow, next, you can write recipes that reference them. In fact, next, you can reference your own recipes, not just those of others. This is actually considered good form. In this example, the processing recipe written by Tim Sutton, he could have just written a monkey recipe because that's what he needs. But what he did is, because he did some extra work to make it download properly, he wrote a download recipe so that someone like me who needed it in a package format could leverage the work that he used. So my processing DS recipe calls the processing package recipe as a parent, which then calls Tim's processing download recipe as a parent. So you're saying, hey, if we can leverage off the other work of other people, next slide, are there recipe repos that we can take advantage of, that we can do exactly as I said, we can pile on top? Next slide. Yeah, there are 75 of them now in the AutoPkg project. There are also some that individuals have that have not incorporated them into the project that are also available if you know where to find them. But, excuse me, these are all user contributed, and this has exploded in the last year. When I did a stat on this last year about this time, there were 46 repos. So we got more and more people in the community contributing repos. I call that, next slide, a recipe for success. So I've intimated it's been fairly successful. How successful has it been? Next slide. When Greg Nagel did this session, you ought to check out AutoPkg, and I'd recommend you actually go back and look at it. It's still completely valid and talks about using AutoPkg from the command line and some really nifty tricks that way. This is, in Greg's inimitable way, how he'd counted how many recipes were being used. Next slide. So here's a little more slide-friendly version of that. So 2 years ago, this is where we were at. Next. A year ago, at least the number of download recipes had doubled. The number of total recipes had taken off because now other people were incorporating it into their workflows. You'll see like the JSS ones, for example, went from almost nothing to 114. So Casper users are saying, hey, this is something we can use. Next, to now, we've got over 4,000 recipes, and that's about 2 weeks ago when I did the tally. That download number is the big one, because that implies that we've got over 1,000 different software products in the repos of the people in the project, of which I am one. It's fantastic. Next slide. And it's also diverse. So now we also see we've got a new processor where you can actually have AutoPkg physically install stuff on the machine that it's running. I would probably recommend that as something you want to use for your own personal Mac, because then if something goes wrong, you can always remediate, but probably not out in production. But I think this is a really good option. You can see other commercial products are in there, and that .ds one, that's my contribution to the world in this case. You saw in my diagram earlier, I talked about how I could feed every part of my workflow. Well, I feed DeployStudio with AutoPkg using these recipes, and all the .ds recipes are basically a way to copy whatever package has been created into wherever you have your DeployStudio repo. Next slide. So one of the things that makes all the good stuff happen for your specific spot, because I just mentioned, for example, in DeployStudio, you want to put in your own specific spot, is overrides. So basically what an override does is it lets you take those input values you saw in the recipe before and use your own values. Most of the time, most of the values will be the same depending on whatever you're doing. But sometimes you'll need something specific to yours. And like I said, in my case, the DeployStudio repo would be the perfect example. Basically what it does is I showed you how before how you could chain recipes up where my DeployStudio recipe calls a package recipe, calls a download recipe. Well, an override essentially calls my DeployStudio recipe or whatever terminal recipe you have. It's essentially a new child recipe without any steps in the process section. Next slide. So I'm going to do you a quick call a slideshow walkthrough of AutoPkg, the nice GUI that goes on top of AutoPkg. Let's go through a case where you'd need an override. So you see the basic interface. Up top is the list of repos in the AutoPkg project. You can add your own manually, as you can see. Check or uncheck whatever you need. If your recipe calls another person's recipe repo, you need to check that, and then it'll download it. Bottom half is where the actual recipes are that in the repos that you have checked. Now I've gone ahead and it goes in alphabetical order, whatever order you want to sort it in. I've scrolled ahead to Adobe Flash Player because I think that's probably, at least for the next year or so, probably relevant to pretty much everyone in the room. Next. So I've got a recipe here for Adobe Flash Player that you would use if you wanted the current version and you signed up for the distributed license agreement with Adobe. You all did that, right? I happen to have done that. Next. So I wrote a recipe that uses that, other than the one that's in the AutoPkg repo. And so I'm just going to right click or control click on this and I get a nice contextual menu. So let's get some information on this. Next slide. So there's the info. Let me zoom it in a bit for you. Next. So in the recipe, it says downloads the latest version of Flash Player, and then it says it requires that you create a recipe override in order for it to work. And I've told you in there what the variable is, what the input key is that you want to override, because when you sign up for the distribution license agreement, Adobe emails you your site-specific version of that URL where you can find the downloads, and that's what the recipe needs. Next. So great. So let's pull up the contextual menu again, and we'll now create an override using that command at the end. Next. So it offers a name. Usually the default makes the most sense, but if you've got a more general recipe that may allow you to do different products with the same recipe, you might want to change this name. For example, Alistair Banks, who is also there this week, is writing Microsoft Office 2016 recipes. So if in your implementation, for example, for a lab machine, you might not want Outlook on there. You might just want Word and Excel and PowerPoint. So he has a recipe that you can override and put one of the input keys will be Microsoft Word. Override it again. The input key will be Microsoft Excel. So in those type of cases, which I actually use, I would want to, let's say, change it to, say, Microsoft Word package recipe instead of the default. In this case, we'll just use the default. Next. Alrighty. Can you see what's changed in that list in the bottom? Next. The recipe identifier has changed. It's now a local reference instead of a reference to the GitHub repository that the original recipe comes from. So let's actually open up this override so you can see what happens with it. I'm just going to open it in Text Wrangler for you, or a screenshot of Text Wrangler. Next. So here's the override we just created. It's got an identifier. It's got an input key. And if you see lightly highlighted in yellow, I have a completely unusable URL. So if you even tried to run it without the override, it would just fail. So that's where you'll put in between the string tags, that's where you'll put in the URL that Adobe gave you. And you'll notice then it calls the parent recipe, which is the one we overrode, and there is no process section. So once we go back in, we could run it from the contextual menu, because you can actually say, as you might have seen in the menu, it says run recipe or run this recipe only. You can do that, but more likely what you're going to do is you're going to check the box right beside it now that you've got the override created. And then every time you want to run it, you can run batches of recipes with AutoPkg, and AutoPkg makes it easy to set up to do that on a schedule, whether that is, let's say, once every few hours or once a day at a particular time. It's really quite flexible like that. It uses a launch statement to accomplish this. Next. So I hope I've whetted your appetite into getting involved and getting AutoPkg running, and then maybe even if it's appropriate for you, contributing some recipes. I could have done this whole talk on AutoPkg. But there are other great resources out there for you that I really want to point you to that can move you well on your way to using AutoPkg. The talk I referred to earlier by Greg Nagel, who's in another room right now talking, is, again, it's probably the gold standard. He and Tim Sutton also did one in the following September at Mac Sysadmin. That's also quite good. Probably if you're in a Casper shop, that would be a beneficial one for you to watch. I mentioned Elliot Jordan from the Lindy Group. He did a fly-through on how to use it, much like I did, but an actual video, and how to configure it all for University of Utah Mac admins. That's the first link there. And just actually, it's just under 2 weeks ago now, actually a week and a half ago now, at Mac DevOps YVR in Vancouver. The videos are already up for that session. He did a short talk on how not to use AutoPkg, and he starts actually dealing with some of the security issues and the, how do you verify packages and stuff like that. So once you get involved in using AutoPkg, there's some real good resources there. And finally, if you're the person who likes to go step by step, have the steps out on a text, like on a web page or a set of instructions, Emily Kozlik wrote a really good AutoPkg for Dummies. It's actually very similar to the video from University of Utah that Elliot Jordan did. And it's a really great, okay, I just installed AutoPkg with AutoPkg. How do I set it up for the first time? So I'd recommend that as a good way to do it. The other thing is when you start writing your own recipes, you'll also want to learn about Recipe Robot. But having said that, there are so many recipes right now, you'll probably be able to start without writing any recipes of your own other than overrides. Next slide. Last time I did this talk, I did a lot into making packages, doing packages, stuff like that. Yeah, if you really wanted to know about that, you're probably in the wrong room. But then again, Greg's sessions always overfill, so I definitely would recommend watching the video. I even just looked at even if you look at the slides from the day-long workshop he did last year, I believe it was. Yeah, it was last year that he and Nick McSpadden prepared and Greg presented. There's lots of resources in there. And anytime Greg does a talk on packaging, it's worth your while to see it. So I'd watch the video of that talk when you get home. In my 2012 talk, some of the principles about stripping stuff out that's CRUD, I still stand by, still very useful in that regard. There are things obviously that have changed, but rather than repeat them here verbatim, you can always go back and look at that. And these days, the packaging tool of choice, if you have to make your own packages for free, is called simply Packages. The link is there. If you're a commercial user or you need to learn about snapshotting, Jamf Software also has Composer, which is, I believe, $80 US, $80 to $100 US. I think the price might vary depending on education or not. That may be a useful tool to you if you like. Okay, so that's the first section, packaging. Next slide. So if all is well, and if you haven't met Rob Furr, who's moving the slides for me, he's a tenure track instructor at the University of Calgary and is helping me out because I'm stuck here. So Rob, we're on the grid of 4 squares. Are we all good for alignment here? Excellent. So the next topic we're going to talk about is image creation. Next. So let's do the what's hot, what not thing again. What's in fashion these days is making thin images. If you know me, I hate that actual term thin images because it means different things to different people. But basically just that it's you're not trying to pile everything into it, which is what I would call where you're piling everything into it, monolithic. Monolithic doesn't necessarily mean that you're capturing the image, although that's also completely out of favor right now. It means that you're trying to put absolutely everything, including the kitchen sink, into your image, nothing in that customizing phase. So doing stuff modularly, so if you're going to build an image, making it modular, that's certainly the best practice right now. And it's great if you want to build images modularly. It's great for testing in VMs. So for example, Joe Chilcote, who is also there this week, he's developed a tool called vFuse, so that if you're using VMware Fusion and you want to take and you build a modular image, you can convert it to use in a VM with VMware Fusion. So for testing, that's fantastic. Next slide. So back at that conference in Sweden, in this case 2013, Kevin White, who literally wrote the book because he has done Apple training manuals, wrote the book on some of this stuff, posed the question, when does imaging make sense? And I think his take here is really good. It's when it's the best solution. And he's given 4 possibilities of when imaging. And so in his case, we were talking about image creation and then using that image, whether it's the full payload or not. Next slide. So create a base system image for testing or deployment. If your environment is often reset, and those of us who are doing education labs or any type of public stations, nuking and paving is a regular part of the job in most cases. And he also suggested truly homogeneous environments where if you got all the same of one computer, you don't have to worry about, oh, is there a special build on that computer? Next, I want to add a couple items to that list. When speed of or bandwidth of redeployment matters. Obviously, bit copying an image is a lot faster than copying the installer and having it install. So if you are limited by your bandwidth, then making an image makes sense. The best current example, again referring to Nick McSpadden, who now works at Facebook, for their situation, they have many distributed points around the globe. And apparently, if I heard his talk correctly on MacBrain, you can still go to macbrain.org and see his little 15-minute talk on this. They have 60 odd distribution sites, and they update them nightly, but it's around the world. So nightly really varies. What might be off time for internet is prime time in another part of the world. So he's created a tool called AutoDMG Cache Builder that basically leverages Monkey's ability to, leverages Monkey, which they use, to pile all the stuff into the image in a cache location where Monkey would expect to see it. So that way they can build it in a distributed manner, and then their imaging is fast. That's the biggest commercial example I've had. But maybe your situation is, we only got 100 megabit. Speed matters. So I have one other reason next, and that's the reason that I still do have some weight or girth in my image. I deploy Final Cut Pro 10 and Logic Pro 10. And especially with Logic, there's literally 40 gigabytes of information that have to get piled in there. It might even be up a little more than that. So what I do is I collect those packages that Apple normally installs when you ask for that. I put them in my image because, quite frankly, they don't change very often. If they were changing every week, I wouldn't do it this way. I'd keep it outside the image. But since they're changing every couple years, then it's worth the while for me to put it in the image and make that part of the copying or that part of deployment faster. Next slide. So I've already referred to it, but the tool that is the cream of the crop, the one that everyone is using basically, unless they developed something before this was out, that's AutoDMG. You'll hear it called AutoDMG. apparently AutoDMG started kind of as an in-joke, but it stuck. And so that's what I'm going to call it. It's by another one of our big open source contributors, Per Olofsson from the University of Gothenburg. And if you're in a lab situation, if you want to create a minimal image, testing image, AutoDMG was built for that. It's built for minimal images, but you can scale up. Next slide. So AutoDMG supports both command line interface and the GUI. I suspect most of you will want to use the GUI because it's pretty simple. Next, you just need an OS installer that you downloaded from Apple. In fact, it's even smart enough to use a cached image, so you can build upon your work if speed's an issue. Next, and a collection of packages, apps, and or disk images that are a wrapper for an app or a package. So basically, whether it's in a disk image or out of a disk image, it can handle apps and packages. You just drag and drop them in there. Now, in the middle there, you'll see it's kind of grayed out because in this screenshot, I hadn't dropped an installer on it. But there's a section that says a checkbox for apply updates. Well, that's actually a list of software updates that gets updated every time you launch AutoDMG, as long as you've got the preference checked. And it will go pull that down from GitHub with the latest results. Now, so for example, when there was a new version of the RAW processor for Apple for camera images, Camera Raw, that came out, I think, sometime last week. And so if you were to go into the App Store and check for updates, it would be there. So that's what this tool does. So what happens normally is Per goes in, he has a process that's documented on the website, and he takes and he changes the catalog, which you then download automatically, that says, oh yes, here's the latest Apple updates for this version of the OS, and this is where, I know how to download that. In this case, the aforementioned Tim Sutton, because it's out on GitHub, he actually did a pull request. He did the work this time. And Per said happily, great, it's ready. And he accepted it into the project. So when I did this talk 2 years ago, and we were talking about things like that, when I did my AutoDMG talk 2 years ago, that happened at that time too, because strangely enough, Europeans take real holidays. They're not tethered to their computer while they're on vacation necessarily. So this works great. So this also gives you the flexibility that if you want to hold back on certain updates, you don't have to update. You can use your own catalog, and there are instructions on the website to do this. But regardless, you just click the download button if you've done that, and it'll download those updates. It will cache them, so you don't have to, every time you build an image, if it was like you built it 2 days ago, you still got the updates sitting there for you. So I hope you can visualize this. All you have to do now, after you've dragged the installer in, downloaded the system updates that would normally come from system update through the App Store or software update server, and dragged your packages in, you just click the build button on the bottom, and it will create for you a never booted image, no cruft. This is the beauty of creating a modular image. Next slide. So this is what I put in a testing image. Your mileage may vary, but I find this useful. Per has another tool called Create User Package. It's useful in all sorts of ways. Even if you choose not to do this and you want to create a user account, I use this. I would use this in DeployStudio even over DeployStudio's method of creating user packages. It's great. It basically installs and activates a user. You can set whether it's admin, whether it logs in automatically, the icon, all sorts of great options. You can assign what the UID number is. So if you want a hidden admin user, for example, you can give it a number under 500. I recommend you use that tool regardless of what you're using. So I pop that in, and so I put an admin user in. because if I'm testing, I want to have that built for me already. I then skip the Apple Setup Assistant. This is well documented online. You're basically just touching two locations in the file system, so Apple doesn't run the Setup Assistant. I don't bother at this point trying to suppress the request by Apple. Do you want to send us a check for, oh, what am I thinking of? The help out there. Oh, do you want to send if do you want to send notes to Apple if an app crashes, and then if you want to send it to for third-party developers as well? I don't bother trying to skip that. You can. There are ways to skip it documented online, but for a testing image, I'm willing to just click through that once. It's not a big deal. And then a plain text editor. My choice is Text Wrangler, the little cousin of BBEdit. BBEdit I have on my main machine, and you saw me use Text Wrangler earlier. It's a free offering from Barebone Software, and they have 25 years in the business, but you can use, for testing purposes, I like having a plain text editor that has some features. Next slide. So if you do choose to build a modular image for something other than testing, I do want you to ask the question, does it really need to be there? Is it absolutely crucial that, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, speed or other things, does it have to be there? Because as you know, if you've ever excuse me, if you've ever tried to do that, or even in DeployStudio, you, instead of saying take this package and install it on first boot, you say no, install it right now onto the machine before first boot. Some of those don't work, and in the AutoDMG wiki, Per has laid out very well which packages are likely to fail. So you don't have to do the testing, or you might find out the answer when you say, well, why doesn't that work? Usually it's a case of the script, assumes there's a post installer in script in the package that assumes that it's installing to the booted drive. Well, in this case, that's a bad assumption. You're installing right onto a sparse disk image, which then gets compressed up at the end. So that's a really good reference for if you are putting stuff in your image. What are the problems going to be? Next slide. So I did a whole talk last time I was at Penn State on this very topic. You can find it there on my lab's website, or in my my help for IT professionals. You can get the slides and the video link from there. Per had asked me if he would be able to put it on the AutoDMG homepage, because I actually go into some depth in the back half of the presentation on some advanced AutoDMG tools, and I was so thrilled that he thought that work was good enough that it was posted there. So those are the easy ways to look at a more in-depth talk on modular image creation, if that's what you want to do. Having said that, that next talk from last year by John Kitzmiller, it's kind of almost the counterpoint, or what you should be thinking about when you're doing modular imaging. Spoiler alert, imaging is dead. There's a quite notable slide that went around the community for a while from that presentation. So that's imaging and image creation. Next slide. We're back to our grid again, and the third topic is deployment. Next slide. So you remember this from the earlier in the talk, and I've just suggested to you that you should be taking content out of your images. So if you're taking content out of your images, where the heck are you putting it? So it goes to the customizing phase. After you have a known bootable system, have it install after the fact. And one of the main reasons to do this is because if you're a user, how do you install, on your own personal computer, how do you install software? Well, you download it, whether, well, let's say not from the App Store. App Store kind of automates that process. But you're going to a third party that isn't using the App Store. What do? You download it, you run an installer, all is good. Well, if we put it in the customizing phase, we can make it so that it mimics that process as much as possible, but in an automatic way. And so the beauty of that then becomes the repeatability of it, right? And the fact that it's as close to what a normal user would do as possible. Next slide. So here are tools that you can use in the customizing phase. And there are more than I've listed here, but DeployStudio. I'm sure some of you out there simply have used DeployStudio as a way to get an image onto a computer and maybe set some settings like the time zone and that like bind to AD perhaps, those type of things. Well, DeployStudio does all sorts of things with packages. I mean, my current workflow has probably 20, 25 packages in it for deployment. So it's very flexible in this way. It can do a lot of things. It is technically free, but it is closed source. That's why the next tool on the list, Imagr by Graham Gilbert, has come to fruition, because when there are problems with a closed source tool, you can't just go in and fix it. So Imagr is basically currently a command line tool that runs off of XML files. So again, just likeplists, easy enough to edit on your own, that determines the payload. It's built for a kind of situation where you want a less bulky, a thinner image, if you will, but it's not impossible to use it for a more a bigger payload. Of course, in that customizing phase, any management system you have, whether it's a commercial system like Casper or Monkey, for example, this is a way you can get stuff installed on first boot, and those tools can then get that onto the computer, such that before the user ever logs in, it'll get installed. And that's what I'm kind of defining as the customizing. Until it's in its desired state, we're still in the customizing phase. And of course, many of you may have already invested in Apple Remote Desktop. If you're like me, you invested in it when it was $500. It's still paid for itself. At $80 for any of the manual work you have to do, it's quite good. So you can use it in the customizing phase here. You get put it on a task server and have it do something like that. And of course, there's always, I haven't listed it here, but there's always the technique of, okay, just go sit at the machine and do it manually. Of course, that's the least efficient, and we're talking about automating stuff. But let's not, if your operation is small enough, sometimes to take that extra, the last 5% until you learn how to do it or automate it, sometimes it's still easier to just do it manually. So I don't want to discount that, but the idea is we want to start automating as much as possible, because it then becomes repeatable and beneficial to make it so that you're getting consistent product out every time. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about DeployStudio in specific. As I mentioned before, DeployStudio uses packages. Now, it can't do disk images, doesn't know how to deal with those, or drag and drop installers. That's why you saw in my DeployStudio recipes, I also wrote a package recipe just before it if it didn't exist, because DeployStudio wants packages. What some people don't realize, even people who have used the product for quite a while, is you can create sets of packages. You literally, in the sidebar, you just say, you're in packages, say I want a new set of packages. You just drag them down like a playlist from the packages list, just like you might in iTunes. And then in your workflow, instead of having, let's say, if you want, when I install 20 packages, I don't have 20 package things in my workflow, so it goes, makes the screen as wide as I can get it. I have one or two or three that have batches of packages. And as I suggested before, deferring installs till first boot is generally what you want to do with almost all cases. There might be a couple of exceptions, but especially if you know it works. But really, the deferred install is what makes it as close to a manual install process and thus most likely to succeed as possible. The other thing that some people don't use is nested workflows. And only in recent versions have you been able to nest more than one level, but that is currently supported. In fact, there was a new version of DeployStudio that actually came out yesterday. So if you haven't jumped up, there's a new version late available. And for nested workflows, what's really interesting about that is I use it now for example, I have a workflow that's just the standard settings I do on my machine. So on every machine. So for example, as I mentioned before, set the time zone, turn on, I run a script to run, turn on remote management, like file sharing, remote control, set up my printers, right? So I have those in a workflow that then if I have variations like, well, do I do something different for lab X over lab Y? Or do I do something different because that's a fusion machine as opposed to a single drive? I can have different workflows that are basically the same, but just have that one in there. And that is also great for testing different parts of the workflows, because no one says in a DeployStudio workflow you have to ever deploy an image, right? So there are things you can do even after the fact that are really kind of nice. And so pretty easy to test some things because you don't have to absolutely put an image out in the front. That way you get reusable stuff, reusable workflows. Saves you time. Next slide. But DeployStudio has limitations. And I was doing a workshop with Tom Bridge at the Mac Deployment Conference here in Calgary, here being where I am, not where you are. And we came across some of the, we'll call them current bugs or limitations when we were doing that workshop. The one we came across in the workshop is the one listed in the middle. Fusion drive imaging is problematic basically because of how the bless command has changed or been replaced in 10.11 over 10.10. So if you're having problems, it's well documented both on the DeployStudio forum and if you're in the MacAdmin Slack, which I bet a bunch of you have signed up for this week. It's fairly well documented, and although different people are having different problems, booting from a 1010 netboot image or any 1010 bootable image is the best workaround for it now. I've shown you the link to the DeployStudio forum for that particular topic. And as I mentioned before, you can't install anything in a disk image, but you can copy files, and as I alluded to, you can run shell scripts. For example, that's how I set up my printers. I just have a couple command line commands in a shell script. The thing that is a little bit infuriating, even when you do those, whether you use batches of packages or not, you can't actually 100% control the order in which packages install. I cannot tell you why. It's closed source. I can't go in and pick in there and find out why. It will approximately install within a group of packages, a set, I should say, in alphabetical order. You can't change that. And in fact, sometimes it's as if it's triggering more than one at a time. And sometimes a smaller package will get in before a bigger one, and it won't be absolute alphabetical order. So you can't even count on that. So for example, I had a software product called Notability Pro where I had the installer But every time I ran the full installer, I had to rerun a serializer because the serial number had been put into the actual app bundle. So that's fine. I created a package that just had that one element, and every time I ran that after. Making them different alphabetically was not enough. I basically, for this purpose, for anything I have where I have, like, let's say the original and then the update, for example, that's a very common one, or anything I want to run first and second, I have literally batch 1 and batch 2. Because when they're like that, everything in batch 1 is likely to install before batch 2. Now I kind of hedge my bet and I put something in between just to make sure. Could be another package, could be, let's say, a call to the workflow to make my settings. Doesn't matter. But just understand that that's a bit of a quirk about using sets in DeployStudio, or even packages at all. But if you're starting to put more in there, you'll find that it'll take some trial and error before you get the methodology or the workflow that works properly for you. Next slide. So we've now got to the point where I can describe my whole workflow. This is what I have been using. I'll tell you at the end why that's going to change. And in fact, it's the reason I'm not there giving this talk and I'm at home giving this talk. So what I do is as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, I collect stuff. Some of it is stuff that I create. Some of it is stuff I get from vendors. So there are certain things I collect manually, certain things I collect with AutoPkg. And those manual things can go either into the image, like, for example, create user package. I still put my admin user in there, and the clear registration package to skip setup assistant. I put that in there. Most everything else will go into the customizing phase. Then I use AutoPkg to feed other stuff into the image creation, because there's, for example, a couple odd things that I've had trouble using AutoPkg to turn into a package, but they work just fine if I drop the disk image that gets downloaded into AutoDMG. So I make an exception for that and throw that in there. But I also have, obviously, AutoPkg feed my DeployStudio repo with DeployStudio recipes. I think I'm running about 30 right now. Some of it's just flash updates, but the benefit of that is if let's say a hard drive was to go down and I had to nuke and pave right now, all my latest updates are already there. Because during the year, if you're pushing out updates manually, your machine's not going to be very caught up. Especially with the payload I have, and that's something I didn't reference yet. My payload is about 115 gigabytes of apps. It's a load. Right now, I would say about 50 or so is in the image, and the rest is in the customizing phase. So it's very useful to have AutoPkg feed with the latest updates so that I can deploy anytime. And of course, I use AutoPkg to collect updates that, because during the fall and winter terms, so about 7 or 8 months of the year, I have a student helper. I've actually got them I can actually say, okay, go take this update that I've downloaded via AutoPkg, because AutoPkg, I've got it set to email me and say, hey, there are new updates. It feeds that back to me and tells me, and so then I just tell someone to manually deploy it, or I do it myself with Apple Remote Desktop. And in fact, those 2 arrows going from customizing to update collection phase are right in the cycle of things, but I've skipped the middleman, and all my updates, as you might have figured out, are going to my DeployStudio repo, and I just tell my student technicians to access the DeployStudio repo for that package. So that's the end of that section. Next slide. Finally, in my quadrant of stuff, and we're doing pretty well for time actually, user management. So again, we're doing the what's hot, what not thing. Modifying the system template. Don't expect that to last forever. In fact, there were signs with 10.11 that it might go away. If you're using that to make settings, there are better ways. And hopefully I'm going to point you to some of them right away. But basically, if you're modifying the system template, there should be a way with a configuration profile to take care of this. If you're like me, you've been using local MCX for a while, and because it was a much more, robust way to change things and lock things down, quite frankly. But it also, while I believe it still works, you're going to want to get those settings that you so carefully crafted and get them into configuration profiles as well. Because that's where we're going. That's what Apple uses. Originally started on iOS, but is now a major part of Mac deployment. In a small lab, you've maybe been able to get away without using them at all. But I really encourage you to start trying, and I'll give you a couple examples in a moment. The other thing that's really hip these days with the Cool Cats is a tool by Joe Chilcote, who I mentioned earlier, who is there this week, called Outset. And I'll talk about that in a little more, because I think it's something that even if you don't start doing a wholesale change right now, there are things you can use in Outset that can make your life easier, even with stuff like pushing out updates that, for example, require a restart, for example, or the user needs to be logged out in order to do that. Next slide. So I've already talked a little bit about configuration profiles. Let's just be clear. Configuration profiles are .mobile config files. Underneath them, they're just a plist. So that means you can edit them and create them yourself. The good thing that Apple's done is they've made it easy to install. I mean, in the Finder, you can pretty much just double click on one and it'll ask if you want to install it. And there are other ways as admins we can put it on that are not so hard. Next slide. So how do we create configuration profiles? Well, one way is Profile Manager, because that's essentially, if you will, that's the Apple way. So if you have a copy of Server App, or if you don't, spend the $20 and get it, you can make it using Profile Manager. And in fact, probably the main reason you might want to have Server App is for the caching server. So if you already have it, you don't actually have to deploy these profiles using, like have them log into OD. You don't have to do that. We can just use it on a standalone computer to build profiles. And so when we're done, we can download it. So let's just do a quick once through. I'll do a slide-like demo like I did for AutoPkg to get us through how you might create a useful profile for you. Next slide. So you fire up the Server App with a non-admin account on that Mac, or if you've set it up in a VM, because that's another way that would be useful to test it. We want that so we can create the profile. So in this case, I've gone onto my Mac. I've created, I've got a non-admin user, and I've created a group called Profile Manager just for fun that I'll be able to, that I've made that non-admin user a part of a group. And that's how we're going to create that's the user I'm going to use to create the profile, essentially, or the group I'm going to use to create the file. Next. So once you've turned Profile Manager on, because you need to do that to make this work, down at the bottom, you'll see there's a button that says Open in Safari. So let's do that. Next. And so when you do that, you'll get a window that looks kind of like this. So select groups, select the group I created called Profile Manager. And then there are 5 tabs across the right-hand side of the thing. I'm in Settings. Next. So just click on the Edit button. Next slide. And you'll see this. This is where the real work is done. On the left-hand side, you'll see a scrolling list that will let you change all sorts of settings. Some are for Mac OS and iOS, some are just for iOS, and some are just for Mac OS. For those of you who used to use Workgroup Manager to do some of these things, some of these will look fairly familiar to you, but there's actually, it's a little more granular, a little more category. It scrolls for quite a while, as you can see by the size of the scroll bar. So we're going to scroll down to the Mac OS section. Next slide. And you'll see lots of interesting options over there. In fact, you can't see them all because of the size of the screen. But I'm going to select the Finder one. And so as you can see in the slide where Finder is selected, we haven't set anything yet. So it offers to configure. So let's click on that configure button. Next slide. It gives us this. 2 tabs, preferences and commands. Those preferences look fairly familiar, don't they? So check or uncheck as you see fit. Next slide. And under commands, if you want to block access to last remaining DVD drive you have in your lab, you can do that if you want. All those settings are there. Now you'll notice in the left-hand sidebar, it already says that the payload is configured. As soon as we added that, it created a mobile config file behind the scenes. If you decide that that wasn't what you wanted, there's a minus sign on the top right-hand corner. You can kill the payload. But there's no need to actually save. It basically auto-saves. So we could then go and change any other number of categories, because essentially we're trying to set this up for a user in the profile manager kind of mindset. These are all the settings that will apply to this group. So when we're done creating our profiles, we're going to click OK down the bottom right. Next slide. And that kicks us back out there. So down the bottom right-hand corner, you've got a save button now. So let's save those settings. Next slide. And so shortly thereafter, once it's saved and figured things out, you'll notice that in that settings area, there's now one for the Finder. And next, a download button has been activated. So great, that's exactly what we want. So we'll go ahead, click on that download button, and we will get a user scope profile so that we can use it with any user. That's it. So if you want to create profiles for things that Apple knows how to control, this is a great way to do it. And that mobile config file, you can open up, like I said, in a text editor, change things, and even examine to see how it works. I will admit it's pretty ugly. That is to say, all the XML is on, other than the header, is on one line. So all the settings are one line, but it's easy enough to break out manually, or using a tool like BBEdit, which has code formatting. You can get a very good idea of what it's doing under the hood if you're the curious type. Next slide. There are other ways to make configuration profiles as well. MCX profile from, once again, Tim Sutton out of Montreal. He figured that people like me who had used local MCX or MCX at all would want to start using profiles, and this tool converts it. This is a really great place if that's the method place to start, if that's where you're coming from. For methodology, you probably still want to break out your profile, whereas in like MCX, you'd have one big monolithic one. With configuration profiles, you're probably going to have many configuration profiles, and that's okay. And probably, again, just for the same reasons with modular imaging, modular profiling will probably also be beneficial to you. The thing that isn't obvious from the title of that is if you've got a P list and you've stripped it down to the things, for example, that you would normally change in the through mangling the system template, you can take a P list and you can use MCX profile to convert the P list. So that's really quite exciting. And if you want to start building your own profiles, but you want to just, it's like, I'll keep my MCX or I'll keep what I'm doing right now, but I want to just try profiles and maybe I don't have a server. DocMaster by Michael Page from Australia is a really good place to start. He's got it at, he basically was originally a tool he wrote in PHP. And that's the second link on there. You can just drag and drop. It'll create a mobile config file that will manage your dock. And in a lab setting, many of you will want to manage the dock. It is what I actually use. The response was so great when he put it out that he actually decided that this would be a great chance to open source something. So he basically used it as a project to learn Swift. And so it's still command line, but you can use that, especially if you want to be able to do reusable. So the PHP one was still available. Excuse me. You can still, it's really great in that it's very easy to use, but it's not reusable. You have to drag all the items you have in the dock in every single time, or every single session, I should say. The other one is the one on GitHub is reusable. Next slide. Luckily, you are replete with sessions at this conference on dealing with profiles. Our friend Greg Nagel did one yesterday. And again, with anything that Greg presents, it's usually clear and knowledgeable. It's probably worth a watch when you get home and the videos are up. There's a talk right after this one in Dean's Hall 2 about managing your environment, which includes some talk on profile management. But if you want to do the whole shooting match, there's a talk just on configuration profiles tomorrow at 10:45 in Dean's Hall 1 with a couple people who are really quite knowledgeable. I promised, because we've got about 3 minutes left, and I will hang around for questions for a little bit, but I promised talking about Outset by Joe Chilcote. Sorry, next slide. And next, so that you can see how Joe describes it. Outset is a script which automatically processes packages, profiles, and scripts during the boot sequence user logins or on demand. Can you see the power of this? Next slide. I use Outset to install things into very specific accounts. So for example, I have a single shared managed user that anyone can sit down and use. What I do is, for example, the doc profile, I'll put it in one of the 4 folders. In this case, login once. I will put it in there so that it is signed. So all you have to do to that user, all you have to do with Outset is drop a package in there. If it doesn't install, check the logs. If it'll probably be a permissions issue. It's that easy to use. There are things to check for. And because we're running out of time, I'll point you to this. If you want to take doc profiles, but only assign them to particular users, Nick McSpadden's tool that he wrote when he was at Schools of the Sacred Heart in San Francisco is very useful. That is what I use to make my mobile config profile only apply to one particular user. And he just packages it up using this command line tool. It's really good. And if you want at least a partial demo on Outset, Joe Chilcote is here. You'll have to, difficult choice. You'll have to choose between the configuration profiles session that competes with it tomorrow. But if Outset seems like what you want to do, Joe will have a talk about LaunchD, all those type of things, which is underlying that tool Outset that would be useful to you. Okay, looks like we got about 1.5 minutes. Just like the first time I did this talk, I left not enough time for questions because there is so much content. You can download the slides now at that link. The conference will put them up later on the resources page, but you can download those now. And that lovely feedback link that you've had all week. This is session number 32. So I want to open the floor for questions, and I will hang around as long as, at least for a little while. I do have to go to work. I'm doing this before the work day. But I'll hang around for a little bit for questions, and they can decide when they're going to stop recording. But thanks, everyone. The reason I couldn't come is because as of Monday, I am now a Casper admin. I guess all this experience doing all these new techniques made me the person they wanted to come to instead of my little lab. We're going to be managing probably 2,000 Macs, and we're as soon as possible. So they said, no, sorry, you can't go to the conference. We need you now. So there's hope. If you learn these new things, hey, maybe it's good for, we'll say, going on to bigger and better things if that's what you want. Because quite frankly, the small lab situation is quite nice. So thanks, everyone. We're at the time, but I'll take questions as long as you like. Thanks.